for now, let me just introduce the subject of oysters, and Ranger, Chris Ranger, the lead chief exec of the Saving ESTER project.
Yeah, thank you, Robin.
Okay, Chris, over to you.
So basically, it's sort of from a community interest company point of view, which I set up last year, and primarily are Saving ESTER. The hat sort of says it all. ESTER being ESTER without the H, and it means Cornish. It's Cornish for oyster. So we decided to give it a kind of character name, hoping that would generate some interest. And as Robin said, we've been chatting over the fence for the past couple of months in lockdown. And yeah, I mean, we're at a stage where all bits of presentation and publicity and raising awareness is absolutely critical to our plans. I've written out some ideas and some notes, and I'm going to sort of try and scroll through them to remind myself of key bits. And I've got some slides showing some pictures. Now, I'm not a scientist, but we're doing a scientific project. Pronunciation, terminology might not be 100% correct, but I've come from 12, 13 years of fishing on the fishery, and that's my background understanding of the science required to repopulate a fishery. Well, I mean, on the left there are some shells that were picked up. I mean, I just found them quite fascinating. The middle right shell shows some very fast growing native oysters, and the top shell shows some kind of a much slower growing. You can tell by the rings on the shell. Some areas are better for the oysters and some are not so good. So anyway, back to my little speech that I prepared. I'm delighted to be speaking at this Cornwall Science Community virtual cafe. Thanks, Robin. As a little background, back in 2008, I purchased and restored a 50-year-old traditional wooden vessel called the Alf Smithers. There should be a little photo of her dredging or sailing along to start a drift. It's not your usual fishing vessel, as these were engineless. You can see an outboard on the stern, but we're only allowed to use that as a mode of transport, not a method of fishing. And to be honest, in weather like the day of the photo, they're useless because they're either underwater or they're screaming their heads off. The bylaws were set back in the 1800s, and they stated no machinery. My first season back in 2008 was, well, as to be expected, a disaster. There just wasn't really much yield. In fact, I think I earned £1,600 the first 6 months. But I quickly romanced with the idea of sailing during the winter months, gathering wild and native oysters and playing a part in what was essentially Cornwall's oldest surviving heritage industry. A year later, in 2009, I'll just show you the picture of us dredging, but I can come back to it. I set up a company called Cornish Native Oysters, and it meant I could purify, process oysters at my base in Myler Harbour, sorry. And by processing them, we could sell them to restaurants and chefs and deliver to homes via the web for them to consume. Following several years' work, our unique fishery and its prized oyster was heading for a protected designation of origin status, awarded only to the most prestigious food and drinks in Europe. So in 2012, I registered Fal Oyster Limited. After almost 10 years, I was almost financially ruined, simply because many of the oystermen had given up on supplying a marketable, edible size native in favour of a quick buck by selling seriously small juveniles to other fisheries. It's called a kind of put and take fishery, when they buy oysters, put them on the beds, and then pick them up and sell them as their own. The native oyster, the Fal oyster, has a very distinct characteristics. The flavour's great. Melon, lettuce and cucumber are the kind of descriptive words. We have designed a logo, and we have a PDO logo that goes with it. I think it's a fantastic opportunity to promote a sailing fishing fleet with a native oyster with a PDO. One thing I'd like to point out is, as a fisherman, I get paid by the kilo or by weight. As a merchant, I sell by unit. And quite a few fishermen will fill their buckets with 50-gram oysters, but you need 20 of those to a kilo compared to 10 100-gram oysters. Not only did this leave the industry in decline, but because the sort of boats joining didn't always want to sell to France or East Coast fisheries, they didn't have storage beds that some fishermen have, and are part of a 1901 sort of court case where we have the right to store. But critically, the biomass was in real danger. Without a certain density, then a native oyster will struggle to reproduce. Cornwall Inshore Fisheries Principal Scientific Officer said he fears we're at a density of native oysters that would make successful reproduction incredibly difficult. Some data I collected over the years, 1920s, 800 tons was coming off the 1,100 hectares. I've got a bit of data missing because I haven't managed to find the data for it, but there was obviously a decline sort of during the war, and there's some data missing after the war, and then there was a big decline in the 80s. Basically, a Banamia disease was introduced by importing French oysters. Those oysters then got laid on the fowl, and the smaller ones got sold on to other fisheries and spread Banamia all around the coast of the UK. Quite devastating to the native oyster. The chart at the bottom shows actual landings for the most part of it from Cornwall IFCA's statistics. It showed back in sort of 2014, 89 tons of oysters were landed off the fishery. You can see by the orange on the charts, that's how much was stored on the lays, either because the market was no good or they were too small to sell to the market. The quite horrifying part of that is, the first 6 years, or first 5 years, I did a chart last year, first 5 years were statistical, and the following 3 years were on trend. It showed that last season we would probably do about 20 tons. In fact, we actually did 17, so that's been updated. This season coming, which starts on the 1st of October, shows we might do less than 10 tons. And sadly, the statistics show that the year afterwards, so 2021, there probably won't be enough to land or a market for them or enough fishermen to go and harvest them. I found that as quite a frightening statistic. 85 to 95% of the world's populations of native oysters have been lost. 3 main causes are overfishing, disease, and pollution. And all of those things happen on our fishery. And they're all man-made, really. One of them is very rare, one of them is a big risk, and one of them is just greed. You can probably work out which order they go in. But back in 2017, I stumbled across a World Oyster Symposium, and it's in Bangor University, and so myself and my partner attended 3 days of talks by academics, professors, industry leaders from around the world, and including many oyster producers that I'd come to know in the past decade. While sat in the auditorium with my partner, we listened to many presentations relating to both commercial developments and, well, quite frankly, some devastating news about the decline of native oysters around the globe. As I say, 85 to 95% of the world's populations had been lost to 3 main causes. But that symposium really was a life-changing experience for me. Suddenly, I was in a room with many others who literally lived for oysters. And at the end of the 3 days, my partner turned to me and said, "I've witnessed you battle against the old boys who are intent on discrediting your views to protect themselves. Yet here we are, and everything I've heard this week is exactly what you've said for years." So that was a real eye-opener, really. We learned about many things. There's a slide that shows about the ecosystem services of oysters. I'm part of the Native Oyster Restoration Alliance and the Native Oyster Network UK and Ireland. There's lots of publicity and support for native oysters as a key ecosystem engineer. So as I say, I've been working with the Non and Nora on various things, and we're publishing a paper soon and a handbook. It's been really interesting working with scientists and academia and trying to build up a bit of reputation for the native oysters and restoration projects. The sad thing is we're sat on the Fal, which is probably the last natural native oyster fishery in UK, maybe Europe. There are lots of habitats that are kind of trying to restore themselves, but very few of them have oysters. We're pretty unique on the Fal fishery. I've been working with several universities, backwards and forwards chats, Zooms, and all sorts of bits. And I've borrowed this slide from DEEP, which is the Dornoch Fine environmental project. They're working with Glenmorangie Whiskey, who are introducing amazing things into their business. And one of them being an oyster reef to try and remove some of the remaining 5% of distilled waste. But the chart on the right shows, you know, in orange, some of the oyster fisheries going back to 1883. Huge areas of native oysters were available, and sadly now, you know, we're down to some very few numbers. I'll come back to that slide. It's kind of in a bit of a jumble, but this is another slide I borrowed from a native oyster symposium that was only on Monday, held at the Bangor, or online via Bangor University. So I was quite proud to be invited to give a talk there. It's like this is on YouTube. You can find it by typing in Native Oyster Network Oyster Symposium 20. And I'm in at about 2 hours, 8 minutes for a very brief speed presentation. But you can see from here, there's 11 oyster restoration projects in the UK and 160 network members. To be one of them, I'm really pleased. To be one of the restoration projects, you know, I'm very honoured. To be one of the only ones that has oysters, you know, I'm pretty scared of the consequences if we lose them. Just a quick slide I thought I'd slide in, get in there, is, as it says, in 1946, for example, the summer in Essex and Kent was considered to be one of the poorest for many years. It was good settlement, and many instances have been recorded of hot, dry summers with little spat. Our work has confirmed Coringa's view, 1940, that good spatfalls cannot be expected on seriously understocked fisheries, despite the known fecundity of breeding oysters. IFCA's survey said there's probably 1 per 20 square metres a couple of years ago, maybe a bit better last year, 1 per 10 square metres. And to me, that's still pretty shocking. When you think, or a bit of science is a rock oyster, Pacific oyster, the male spits out the sperm, the female spits out the eggs, and the fertilization happens in the water. With a native oyster, the male spits out the sperm, the female siphons it in, and the fertilization happens in the female shell. So you can see that, you know, if they're not in close proximity, that's not going to happen. The survival rate of a native oyster larvae is 500,000 to 1. So in the wild, it's a very low survival rate. I've been doing some studies over the years and growing oysters from the catch. Now, I don't particularly like landing the small ones, but I would land a certain amount and put them in trays and do a study with the top, middle and bottom in various locations. You know, and there was approximately 30% mortality during these studies, even though they're in trays. And I could work it out because I put 400 kilos, 6,000 oysters. At the end of the summer, I had 400 kilos, or 398, but I only had 4,000 oysters. So what it showed to me was the mortality was evened out by the growth. So when an oysterman puts their oysters on the bed by the kilo, and they pick up by the kilo, there's no kind of track record of the mortality. Now this is partly because it's intertidal. So in the summer, low tide, they're getting really hot, and in the evening, they're freezing cold. Another thing we have on the fishery recently that I campaigned for was queen scallops. And for an example, 2 years ago, 89 tonnes of queens, 35 tonnes of oysters. last year, 65 tonnes of queens, 17 tonnes of oysters. Some of the arguments from the old boys is that its inefficiency has kept it sustainable. And my argument to that is it can't be that inefficient if we can catch 100 tonnes of something, but it does prove the lack of oysters if only 20% of what we catch is our prime product. Another thing on the shell is really important on the fishery, the culch, and that's basically crushed up shell or shell left over. And from this queen scallop shell, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 10 baby oyster larvae spat that are growing on the shell. Now, in the previous photo, you can see some of those queen scallops have oyster larvae on them, and suddenly realised, even though it's a really high commodity and a very necessary bycatch, are we destroying our future stocks by removing spat off the fishery when it goes with a 5 or 10p queen scallop? So I set up a community interest company back in 2019 and applied for some grants. I didn't get any of them, unfortunately. One of the reasons given was it would be cheaper and easier to buy native oyster seed from hatcheries in the UK and France and put them on the fishery to grow. But I knew that was a massive biosecurity risk that even IFCA, who are our regulatory authority, wouldn't support. In January 2020, I had a second meeting and authorities and stakeholders attended, and they seem to have a greater desire to save the industry and the species than many of the old boys. At the meeting, we launched a crowdfunder campaign, Saving ESTER, the Cornish oyster. And as I say, ESTER means oyster in the Cornish language. We also announced news of a new lease for the aquaculture research site, which was due any day. Then, only a matter of weeks later, the country and the world went into lockdown. By the skin of our teeth, with 2 days to go, and I admit a few grants that I had to donate myself, we reached our 8,755 target. It was an all or nothing target. So with a few days to go, being a couple of grand short, or, it was quite frightening that it would all go back. But luckily we did hit our target, and it is now an always on campaign. So we can continue to raise funds and accept donations, although the only thing we can't do is send out the rewards. As I say, we hit our target. It was great. So that was the end of March. April and May, myself and a new non-executive director completed a slight upgrade and transformation of my processing room so that we could create a micro hatchery. Now, this is a photo taken sort of during February, I think, when a photographer came down and I was explaining to him what we planned to do. If we take just a second to look around on the inside of this shipping container, there were some very dodgy electrics, a couple of extension leads, a light, and that was sufficient for me, really, working on my own. Post the funding, we lined the ceiling and the wall. The other wall is basically next to another shipping container, so we didn't feel we needed to do that one. We installed some peristaltic pumps, some heaters, some coolers, some thermometers, sensors, so we could control those. We reconfigured things a little bit. In fact, you can see some wood and oars holding up the ceiling because we had a nightmare trying to get it to stick. We went about our first trial on June the 19th and 20th, just ahead of the new moon. And native oysters tend to release or liberate their larvae, the females liberate their larvae on or around the new moon. And quite probably, within 2 weeks, they're starting to settle, so on the full moon. So they're actually very in tune with the lunar cycles. The tide relies on the lunar, or is part of the lunar cycles. So I guess they're emitting them when there's less flow of spring tides, and so they can float around. By July the 4th, 5th, we had larvae. So this is looking through a microscope that was, raised with or purchased with the raised money. The orangey coloured marks, they're actually algae that we feed the larvae with, and the dots are basically quite a few mini esters. So they're the larvae, which were about 200 microns in diameter. Again, I'm just showing you sort of a photo of the beach showing the oyster growth. Here's an oyster we took off the beach, and you can see another oyster growing on it. So very similar to the queen scallop shell. It proves that culture and fishery habitat close proximity is really important. These things are floating around. I very much doubt that was the offspring of that particular oyster. They just tend to float around, and they sense when there's live oysters around, and they obviously sense that that's the best place to land before they settle. They don't then swim off or disappear. They're literally there until they're moved by humans. This is a photo of a micro reef, which is a little product from a guy in Jersey called Tony. He's been doing native oyster restorations for decades, but he's very keen in our project because it's actually suspended aquaculture rather than linear projects on a beach. We don't have the access to vast areas of beach where we can lay trestles, so our only option really was the aquaculture site. Lobster hatchery have been fantastic. They've donated hundreds and hundreds of trays. You can see the sort of stacks of circular trays, and some various other trays as well, which have much smaller mesh. And the idea is we set up the hatchery, and we can, as soon as they're about 10 millimeters, which is probably a month to 2 months in the hatchery, we can put them in the growing trays, and we can get them up the river into the nursery site and the aquaculture research site. As I say, I've been part of a native oyster network, UK and Ireland, and a Native Oyster Restoration Alliance, which is really a European group of scientists. And the idea is was to write a handbook very similar to some big publications, and to adapt it so that it looked specifically at the native oyster in Europe. I'm very proud. You can just see my name and initial down there. The publication should be live any day, and it's 40 questions of importance to the policy and practice of native oyster reef restoration in Europe. So I'm kind of trying to wrap up a little bit, so what we're looking for really is some volunteers and people to get involved. I'm saying, what's the moral of the story? Well, we've participated in many projects. Our resources at the CIC consist of me full-time and unpaid, plus a non-executive director who helps out 1 day a week. We've not started generating income from the aquaculture site. We aim to provide storage to oystermen for live shellfish, including natives, mussels and queen scallops. We hope to study the growth, maturity and mortality of the native oysters. And yes, when they're deemed to be of an age where they have reproduced over several years, and when we can quantify the level of recruits, baby oysters, that have been liberated from the improved biomass storage, then we do aim to market these as an edible yet sustainable wild aquaculture food resource. So what do we need? Well, I'm sure as many of you are aware, applications to grant funding are time consuming and at best uncertain. You write your entire business plan out, including full financial forecasts, and show quotations from many suppliers, only to be rejected by a panel of experts that have no understanding of the fragility of the industry and the species we're trying to save from extinction. So help with fine-tuning our major project applications might be a good start. Then we have all matters of work-seeking volunteers to help with, namely loading trays with conditioned oyster shell for spat collection, transfer of shell from harbour to aquaculture research site, funding the underwater data sensors and HD imaging cameras, studying the growth by grading, weighing and measuring the juveniles during their stay at the site, developing the hatchery so we can improve on the survival rates of native oysters in the wild, which is, as I said earlier, 500,000 to 1. fundraising, building our bespoke research vessel so we can house the hatchery and nursery tanks required to give the larvae an even better chance of success up the river. Transparent administration work such as company accounts, everything else, web design, social media, film making, editing, so we can archive and share our work to the many other restoration projects, or as we like to refer to ours as a repopulation project. As well as the above, maybe what we seek the most really is a sort of board of trustees with a common interest, so that we can delegate, share workloads, and focus on the really important things. As I say, for me, the most important thing is repopulating this fishery from the dwindling stocks that are left before that is too late. I kind of went on to say, what will you get from this? Well, maybe just recognition in the form of helping us co-author the papers, the many papers that we want to come out of the research. Maybe just the satisfaction that you helped save some of the last native oysters that still exist. Maybe help with scientific evidence that can be used to provide management authorities with information they require to prevent yet another natural fishery from being overfished. Maybe just the satisfaction of seeing sustainably managed wild sailboat gathered native oysters back on the menus. Or maybe you can just donate to the crowdfunder campaign so we can continue our work as we have already set out to do. We've set up Instagram, Twitter, Saving ESTER. Our mutual friend, Robin and I's mutual friend, Mary, her daughter, drew a really nice picture of a native oyster for me during lockdown as part of an art class. It actually cost me £15 to buy the picture off her as well, which was quite a shock. But so this little character has become our sort of logo emblem, and we can print it on t-shirts and bags, and we're able to get a little online shop going so that we can generate some income and put that towards the project. Sort of wrapping up quite quickly, the Fal Fishery itself is quite a large estuary, 1,100 hectares. Sadly, it's been reduced quite significantly because of pollution and various issues going on. Our fishery is getting smaller and smaller. This was the sort of boundary of the main fishery as defined on our licenses and things. The dark areas are really areas that are very muddy and intertidal, and have not really been very good for native oysters for many years. I've got cockles on there, but we haven't managed to get our cockle fishery up and running just because of the pollution in the area. Ruin Creek has now been closed, so that's a whole blue area above, sort of going from the centre up. Myla Harbour is based on the bottom right-hand corner, and the boundary is the line on the end of the postcard on the right-hand side. The slightly lighter blue are the sort of shallower waters, and that's our main fishing grounds, really. And then the very light blue is the deep water channel. And pretty much bang in the middle of the postcard, there's a couple of right-hand turns and then a left-hand turn, then quite a long straight. In the middle of that is the King Harry Ferry, and just to the right of it is our aquaculture site. So, it's all within the boundaries of the fishery, but the aquaculture site is actually a private lease from Cornwall Council. It's quite scary. It's £10,000 a year to rent 252 by 11 metres of river with nothing on it. So it's a daunting prospect with very little income coming in. But this final slide shows, we started a crowdfunder campaign, and we've raised over £10,000 now from over 100 supporters. We converted a room into a micro hatchery. We actually created our first population of larvae very quickly, but we didn't have the site ready, and we didn't have many other things ready. So we're going to trial another population on the new moon of September, which I think off the top of my head is 17th of September. And then a photo of a guy next to a pontoon with some fairly big advertising that we had up the river. We brought it back down just before the storms, and we're now loading up the trays with shell ready to take back up there. We start fishing the 1st of October, and from our fishing efforts, we do plan to harvest and store the juveniles that maybe we wouldn't normally harvest and store, but we think that's much better than them going to France or Colchester. Not that I have any problem with Colchester necessarily, but just exporting stock from a dwindling wild population seems a bit daft, really. So Robin's put several links on his page, and you can find all about us at the savingester.co.uk website. It's actually only a page on my limited company Fal Oyster website at the moment, because I just haven't had time or resources to design a new website. I am in the process of it, and if any of you have got WordPress experience, I'd really like to have a chat. So yeah, Cornish native oysters, micro hatchery and aquaculture site, Fal Fishery, Cornwall. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. That was great to hear. That so much is in the works, pushed by you as well, about native oysters and getting them. So much research as well being done. Just for everybody listening, if you do have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat box. So just in case you need a refresher after our summer break, you'll be able to find that if you probably alongside the bottom or the right hand side of the screen, there could be a chat button, and then you should be able to get a chat box. So if you put questions in there, I'm going to be able to feed them through. Otherwise, if you're happy to come on screen to talk as well, you can indicate that, and we're more than happy to have you ask your question in person too. Before I get to the questions that are already slowly coming in, I'm going to ask you one of my own. So you've mentioned now that you've managed to actually grow your own native oyster larvae just during lockdown or just after. Is this the first time that this has been done?
Yes, there is only one hatchery in the UK now. There used to be a few. That's in Morecambe Bay, and you know, we can't bring anything into our fishery, so it seemed quite obvious to me to try and breed or hatch from our indigenous stock right on the edge of the fishery. You asked quite a difficult question. I mean, I don't think we have many survivors from that first population, as we're classing them. It was a very fast learning curve, and maybe we weren't quite ready. We do have a few survivors, but not as many as the larvae we created. Maybe it was the toxic plastic bins that we used that were brand new. Maybe it was the feed amounts that we fed them. And maybe really we just started too early in our grading and sorting. I did a lot of research, and they said we have to change the seawater regularly. In doing so, we have to siphon, not pump, the water tanks, the seawater tanks, through a series of meshes. And you know, I think maybe we just tried to do that a little bit too early. They're a very sensitive and very fragile little 200 micron creature. But it was a learning curve. We then spent a month sorting out the aquaculture site, and we are planning our second population trials this month. I'm going to retrieve some more oysters from my trays that you saw earlier. So yeah, I mean, it was a very quick learning curve. We managed to create larvae. We weren't very successful in the survival rate. We've learnt some key things from the first trials, but part of this presentation is to see if we can find researchers and scientists maybe that know a lot more than us about what we're trying to do. We know the room works. We're very pleased that we managed to create larvae. Our next trial, or our next goal, is to improve that survival rate. As I say, it's 500,000 to 1 in the wild. They don't have a great desire to stay alive. You know, any one small factor and those oysters are out of here. Yeah, you know, it was a trial. We now have the aquaculture site set up. We're now about to start our fishing season again, so I can get many, many more brood stock to put through the hatchery program. I've actually put a call out on Radio Cornwall on Monday. Julie Scantlebury came and interviewed me, and I've had quite a few good inquiries from there already. One lady, in fact, is a retired scientist who came and visited today, and she's very prepared to offer some time and skills to maybe honing our first trial into a more successful project, you know.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, sounds like, so definitely still very much work in progress, but sounds like a great start.
We can do a population every new moon. So, you know, we didn't anticipate creating them when it happened. We were fairly, you know, we understood it was going to be very difficult to keep them alive in a controlled environment, but we can keep doing this every month now for, you know, the equipment was the key thing. We can do it every month for as many months as we want. And now we have the aquaculture site, we can really get them to a stage where they can go straight back in their environment and carry on growing.
So this trial and error should be fairly fast as well, with in terms of
yeah. I mean, there isn't a book on it. There isn't, you know, there aren't companies that are willing to share their commercial information. It is an art as well as a science of breeding anything, and these things are so microscopic. You know, it was a challenge. It's not like rearing things that you can pick up and move around. They're they're microscopic, but no, it's definitely work in progress. But we definitely learned lots in the first trial, and we're, you know, up and ready to start another trial and continue trialing until we get it right, and then we're ready to grow them on at the aquaculture site. And the key thing really out of all this is what we're trying to get at is, whilst we store our oysters that we've caught and we grow the oysters we've hatched, all of that growth at the aquaculture site is creating a biomass, and that biomass will reproduce on a public fishery. So although we're doing this science and although we're doing things, the storage of, you know, oysters in a closer proximity than 1.5 meters is going to massively benefit the public habit, you know, the public grounds and the environmental habitat.
Sounds great, thanks. Yeah, I've got a few more questions that I'd love to ask in this direction. Before I get too carried away, I will go through some of the questions that have been coming in from the chat. So there's a couple from Robin I'm going to start off with. Robin asks, there seem to be a lot of points made on one of the earlier slides in green circles about the role of oysters in the marine environment in terms of stabilizing sediments and other things. Could you expand on any of this, any of these beneficial roles of oysters?
Yeah, I mean, oysters are a key ecosystem engineer. I mean, again, I'm not a scientist, but I've been working with lots of them. I'll see if I can go back to that slide in a minute. But really, they're filter feeders. They filter 200 litres of water a day. They're incredibly important for the habitat. Other species will only exist in habitats where it's clean water. Marine plants, if there's too much algae in the water column, they don't get the photosynthesis. They're millennia years old, and they are like a coral reef. It was explained in one video online. You know, if the coral reefs were wiped out by 95%, there'd be hell up. But there's, you know, the native oyster has been a northern hemisphere coral reef, really. So there's books and hundreds of publications online, all scientific publications explaining the importance of the native oyster. I've read quite a few of them, and I've been part of the Native Oyster Network. What I'm going to do is just go and try and see if I can go back to my screen and see if I can so I think you were talking about functions and services provided by the habitat. I mean, these are infographics that are being drafted for this handbook that should be published in November. And you know, it's a book that's being built as we're speaking. Really, we've spent several months on it. I think the next slide really, you know, goes into it in greater detail. But one point I want to make is like the carbon sink or source. I've been chatting to a lady in Edinburgh University, and she's called Hannah Lee. She's been doing a load of work on her PhD about blue carbon, which is the quantifying the deposition rates of live oysters or oyster shell, and whether they're a carbon sink or a carbon source. It's huge, really, the ability to, let me just see. So I skipped past this one, but really, you know, this is Hannah Lee's presentation the other day. So I took a screenshot. It's a pretty bad photo of her. She's a really lovely girl, but she looks like she's half asleep down there. But she's done some amazing studies, and her work is about to be published. It just proves that we're on a really fragile turning point in the ecosystem world, that without native oysters, it's like having no trees, basically. So our project is to restore the fishery so that we can harvest a better oyster, and also repopulate it by putting more in than we're taking off. But it's also going to be a massive benefit to the ecosystem around us if we have more oysters. I don't know if that makes sense to Robin's question, but
Yeah, very crucial in so many different parts of the ecosystem as well. Like it was on that slide. That's, yeah, really interesting. I'm going to skip over Robin's second question for now, and go on to another one from Loveday Jenkin, which
hello, Loveday.
I wanted to pick up on because I thought there might be a link as well. So Loveday asks, how's the water quality up at the King Harry Ferry now?
Oh, hello, Loveday. We met several years ago down at Mila when I was trying to protect a bit of quay on behalf of the fishery. But water quality plays a big part in our fishery. Ruin Creek seems to be capturing all the pollution, to be honest. Whether it comes down the river and gets pushed into that creek, the River Fal itself is a flood tide estuary, which means the water is predominantly being pushed in. There isn't a great big river flow behind it. We've lost a big chunk of our fishery to closed areas. They're not really harvested, and then the samples get really bad because the grounds aren't being turned over. You know, the Queen Scallop is really focusing everyone's attention down on the main fishery, and not many fishermen are even attempting up the river now. For the Saving ESTER project and the aquaculture site, you know, pollution of chemicals is a real big problem. Pollution of bacteria isn't really a problem because we're not necessarily harvesting from there, we're just storing. The most of our problems are generally in the summer, unless we get extreme rainfall. But I say the summer because really the sewage companies can't cope with the added population, and the rain and the sewage water going into the same pipe means the pipe gets full quickly and they have to dump it in the river. I think it's pretty archaic, but part of our CIC plan is to build a community of people that, if they are affected, A, can make a claim, and B, can find the source of the problem to stop it happening again. As individual fishermen, we have no say in any kind of legal battle. But no, thanks for the question, Loveday. Hope that kind of answers it, and I must catch up soon.
Yeah, happy to. I think, you know, one of the things that we found during the CCLAP project was that a lot of the sewage pollution in that area was from septic tanks, and I think that was being addressed, but I'm not sure where that's got to now. But I know Tim Light was most embarrassed that he was one of the sources.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Tim's been very good to me over the years, and you know, he donated a bit to the Saving ESTER. I know he's retired now, but having some eyes up the river is a very handy thing when we're deploying lots of produce up there. Took me best part of 3 years to get the lease off Cornwall Council, and to be charged £10,000 a year for doing something is quite a hit. I took it, but I'm contemplated whether it's the right thing to do. But I'm sure either by raising funds or raising awareness of this project, you know, hopefully we can raise some other funding. The only way I could fund it was by getting a bounce back loan. The CIC didn't qualify for any funding during COVID, but it did manage to get a loan. So really, we're committed. We've borrowed. It's a low interest. We don't have to pay anything for 12 months. But really, this fishery, I said it to you many years ago when you came down to the quay, this fishery is Cornwall's heritage. There's a handful of people that are kind of operating and managing it, and it's just not working. It wasn't working back then, and it's really not working now. I was at a committee meeting and someone said, well, we need some marketing. Blimey, the PDO, Protected Designation of Origin, is probably the best bit of marketing you could wish for, but the product isn't delivering. There isn't enough of a medium oyster that's reproduced several times. They're all being exported far too small. I don't know what happened after that meeting, but I know a certain gentleman came up to you guys and asked you what you lot were doing on the quay, and he's put a stop to quite a lot of my industry for his own gain. And Myler Harbour have taken over that little creek behind us. They're my landlords. They say I have no right to pump seawater from that quay into my container, but he has every right to repair his vessel. That's precisely what I was trying to stop happening. And yeah, he stopped me looking after the fishery for his own gain. And that's kind of what's going on this fishery at the moment.
I hesitated to ask a question about the old boys and what they were doing and how, whether you wanted to come on board.
They didn't attend any of the meetings. They tried to stop me getting the aquaculture site. They're doing it for their own reasons. What I'm trying to prove is I'm not doing this for my own reasons. I'm doing this for a habitat perspective. I'm doing this for a heritage perspective. I'm doing this for, a livelihood perspective where everyone should benefit. But it's Cornwall's fishery, and it's a very unique product and a very unique fleet. Some of them are getting older and older and still doing it really badly, and the youngsters can't afford to join in because there's no yield. So I've really gone from focusing on fishing to focusing on promotion and processing to this kind of science side of it. I've had so much support from academia, alliances, associations, Cornwall Council, Cornwall Marine Network, Cornwall Chamber of Commerce, Cornwall Wildlife Trust. This is ticking some boxes, but it's all self-funded at the moment, so it's going to grind to a halt.
How you get to, I mean, I'm happy to help with the politics and the science in any way I can, but it's moving things into profit is quite difficult, I imagine.
Yeah, I mean, we're a non-for-profit organisation. The limited company is a totally separate business. The CIC is piling its work back into, or its income when it starts generating income. But at the same time, native oysters, habitat restoration, blue carbon, you can list any buzzword in any policy at the moment. Boy, we will probably tick 90% of them already. We're not working towards that. We just need to look after it. The old boys aren't interested. They're going to fill their buckets and they're going to sell them to the first person that comes along.
Great, thanks. I'm guessing that's just one small bit of the sort of things you're also up against, just a small insight. I'm going to move it on a little bit from here though. So let's see. We'll go for this question from Chris, who's asking, where did the oysters come from that are really being sold at the Fal Oyster Festival? Are they locally caught ones? Would they be native ones as well?
This kind of went into the papers several years ago. They are oysters from the Fal, but the fishermen, and only 1 or 2 fishermen, are allowed to sell native oysters at the Falmouth Oyster Festival. It bugged me for years. I've been doing a little pop-up in another pub. But to sell 20,000 oysters at the beginning of the season, 1 week into the season, is quite a tricky thing to yield. So what happens is oystermen fish, they put their small ones on the beach where they have a lay, which is an area they've not claimed as their own, but they've marked out as their own to put their stock in. They do that all season. They grow there during the summer, and then in September they can pick them up, process them, and get them ready for an oyster festival. So they are from the Fal, I'm going to say. They are not fresh off the fishery, or very few of them are fresh off the fishery that year. There's nothing to say there's anything wrong with storing them on a creek and growing them on, but my studies say 30% mortality, you know, and 30% growth. 30% mortality out of 15 tons is a lot of oysters dying. And although I've tried to get my foot in the door down there, it's a closed shop. I don't think it's best for the fishery, the lay process. I think it's a real shame. All fishermen aren't allowed to sell Fal oysters at the Falmouth Oyster Festival. And I think it's a real shame, really. The perception of what goes on is very different to what goes on in reality. You know, it's the biggest festival in the Southwest. It's a private festival on private land that looks after a few, and I don't believe that looks after the fishery, really.
That's a shame to hear this side of things as well.
I'm trying to be
Well,
positive.
it's nice to hear about it. It's nice to hear about it. I'm
trying to be positive. Please don't ask us too many. You know, the larvae haven't survived. There's no Oyster Festival, and I mean, I've had many years of wondering what the hell I'm doing, but really, to stay focused is what we're trying to do is to make a big impact on a really dwindling population before it's too late. That's our key thing.
I've got a few more a bit scientific questions, I guess, coming up. One fairly quick one, I guess, from Loveday again. What size do they need to be to grow on at the aquaculture site?
Okay, well, to land them from the Fal Fishery, it used to be a 2 inches and 5/8 ring, and the oyster must not pass through it. IFCA came along and changed that to it must not pass through it when laid flat across the aperture. A circular ring is to measure the shortest width of something, and a linear gauge is to measure the longest length. So we can't take anything off the fishery that is shorter than 67 millimeters in its longest dimension. To me, they're probably a 2-year-old oyster, maybe a little bit older, and therefore they haven't reproduced much, if anything. The larvae that we create in the tanks come from the broodstock, which are probably, you know, a 7 or 8-year-old oyster maybe, mixed up with some juveniles, some younger oysters for the genetics to be carried through. But if we can grow them to about 10 millimeters in our hatchery, in our tanks, then we can take them up the river in some of the trays that was supplied and sponsored by Lobster Hatchery, and you know, we can put them in their natural environment. We suspect that would probably be between 1 and 2 months growth in the hatchery before they can go up the nursery. The minute they grow to the next size of mesh, we can put them in the next size mesh trays, which again have come from the Lobster Hatchery, and we're trying to, actually it's funny, I've been given several thousand trays from a guy in Jersey who's been doing some fantastic work, but it's £630 delivery that I've got to stump up in order to get 3 pallets, you know, freight delivered, which seems a real stumbling block. But again, different size trays, and we want to try different growing trays up the river. We don't know the answer to which is the best, but we know we have small mesh, and that will foul up quite quickly in a watercourse. So there might be a lot of, you know, taking the oysters out, put them in a clean one, and then pressure washing the old one ready for the next week, or that kind of process, which again is quite labour intensive. But what we're saying is it's probably a 2 or 3-year-old oyster coming off the fishery. Only a very small percentage of that is probably the 80 to 120 gram, which is what restaurants and merchants really, they want to buy. If they could buy those, they could sell them all day, every day, lots of them. It's the smaller ones that are really troubled, really hard to sell, unless you're selling them to another fishery. I hope that answers it, Loveday. I hope that answers the question. It's hard to keep a track of everything.
Great, thank you. I'll move on to a question by Steve, which is something I was wondering about during your talk as well, actually. So Steve asks more about the lunar cycle aspects that you mentioned. So how do oysters sense the lunar cycle or manage to synchronize with it? And does that also mean that you need to try and replicate aspects of the lunar cycle when you're trying to cultivate larvae?
I can't answer the first bit of how they communicate with the lunar cycles, but like many species, marine species especially, you know, they understand the conditions. So as I say, if the male and the female need to fertilize, then obviously the sperm needs to be spat out by the male and the female needs to siphon it in. if there's a big tidal range, i.e. a spring tide, and in Falmouth we've got sort of a 0 to a 5.7, 5.8 tidal range on a spring tide. If that's happening, that sperm isn't going to stick around long enough. So it's all in time with when there is less flow of water. So the sperm is spat out and the female can siphon in because that water column, that water source is there hanging around. It's shocking that it's down to about half an hour either side of a new and full moon that the larvae are liberated by the female, and it gives them a couple of 2 weeks nearly before the big spring tide ranges to settle on something, i.e. the colch. Although I don't, yeah, I mean, that's about as much as I know that that's how it works. But yes, we are absolutely replicating Mother Nature in our hatchery. We even have a timer that turns the lights on and off with sunrise and sunset. On a full moon, I tend to go down there and override that timer and leave it on. And we had some really good results very quickly from our very first trials. We take a lot of readings, like total dissolved solids, pH levels, humidity in the room, salinity obviously, and temperature. Most of those we can control and adapt and change, and we are absolutely replicating Mother Nature. All we're trying to do in our hatchery stroke spatting pond area is mimic Mother Nature, improve the survival rate by the small captive area, and I'm talking a couple of thousand litres can hold, or 1,000 litres can hold 10 million larvae. So we're working in IBCs and various things. And just prevent any predators getting in, basically, so that we can control their growth. Well, not control their growth, no, we can sort of protect them. It didn't work, but protect them from lots of variables to try and improve their survival rate. So yes, we are definitely mimicking Mother Nature.
That's really interesting and really precise as well, how you say it, if it's within half an hour of the union.
It's incredible. It's incredible.
Yeah. Wow.
And I mean, I guess they realise that there's a very slack water at that point, or it's going that way or going this way. And, if they can sense there are, I mean, as larvae, they can sense there are live oysters in an area, and that's when they dive to the bottom and find something to settle on. Or they just float around until they find that reef or that area of density. I mean, that's very clever, from a 200 micron animal with no immune system or brain or anything, how they can sense it. I mean, there's some serious papers to be written, or might have already been written, but it's a fascinating species.
Yeah, absolutely. Robin's got another question that is a bit more about conservation strategies in a way, I suppose. So from what you were saying, proximity is central to the Fal oyster's breeding strategy. And you can often see catastrophic collapse of populations when a critical mass is jeopardized. So is there anything you can do to deliberately enhance the proximity of potential breeding couples?
That's precisely our aquaculture site project. There is nowhere or no way we can. Harbour Master won't let us store trays on the beach because he said they're a navigational hazard. They're refusing to allow any trestle or farm activity on the natural fishery. For 10 years, I've tried to get a beach. I got one, and one of the fishermen booted me off, saying it's not mine. It was his dad's, and I took it over from his dad as a gentleman's agreement. But so this aquaculture site is the only chance, I think, of having a biomass that's required to study, to start with, to research, to monitor and manage an area of water. It's not a very big area, but it's 10 meters deep. So we have quite a few beaches if you stack them all up together. And it's a private lease within a fishery area. We would have no control over someone fishing underneath our aquaculture site, because that's on the seabed of a public fishery. But the minute they're in trays and suspended, then it's absolute property. And it's our intention to store oysters rather than sell them to someone else, and to study that biomass. Now, we're not going to put 100 tons up there straight away. It's going to be impossible anyway. But if we can put a few tons up there and put them closer together and put shell around them, then we might be able to see whether they are reproducing. Very early days. We literally took over the lease on the 1st of August. Well, I borrowed some money in July. We took over the lease 1st of August. Like, the money came in on a Tuesday, it was spent by Wednesday, but the site, the moorings, the primary moorings were all installed on the 5th of August, and yep, that's where we are. It's exciting times, but that's the only thing, you know. So we're trying to replicate nature in the hatchery, and we're trying to replicate or improve nature with the aquaculture site by improving the biomass.
That's cool. Two different strategies working in parallel there. Robin also points out that Bangor Uni seems to have a leading role in, I'm guessing he means oyster research in general. Do you know if there's any more local interest from Exeter and Plymouth universities as well?
I mean, I've been working with Bangor. I very nearly signed up to do a master's course this year. There's a few reasons I didn't. COVID was one of them. It's not the distance, because the knowledge is worldwide. I've been working with Edinburgh University. They're very keen on this project. Sadly, the University of Exeter haven't been so keen. I was expecting them to be banging on my door. Plymouth University haven't really come back to me. We've had a few conversations. I jokingly said it's easier to study Madagascan turtles at the University of Exeter than it was Falmouth oysters. I got quite a harsh reply that, you know, people travel the world to do a course here, and they bring that project with them. Universities are quite fund hungry. If you apply for a grant and you're working with the university, they will quite easily take up 50 or more % of the grant, which means less goes to the project, really. I take my hat off. I get on really well with the scientists up at Bangor University. They have a shellfish research centre. I've been working closely with University of Portsmouth, and they have a project called the Solent Oyster. Blue Marine Foundation came and interviewed me back in 2017, and then took quite a lot of my ideas and thoughts and have made that into a very successful restoration project. I wouldn't say successful as in they're creating millions of oysters yet, but they're very publicity driven. And the Zoological Society of London, their Native Oyster Network, UK and Ireland, Blue Marine, have just received 1.18 million to roll out 3 projects, which are identical to what I've been trying to do for years. So it proves there is funding out there and we can tap into it. I think some of the academics say, well, while you've got a fishery, the best way of protecting it is to stop fishing. That's not really going to work. You need to maintain the grounds. Is dredging maintained? It's a hand dredge. It's a very small dredge. You pull it in by hand. You know, it's been happening for thousands of years on this very small defined area. We don't go out to sea and find a new bit and smash that to pieces like scallop boats might do. If you don't turn over the grounds, they silt up hugely, and that just kills all marine life. It's been proven in many reports that, you know, ecosystem engineers are what make a habitat, and if it silts up, for example, Parsons Bank, which is up sort of near Low Beach, is really muddy, and there's not a lot going on up there. Some of the rivers up the river, really muddy, nothing going on. There's no culture. If you don't turn it over, you don't have any growth. A bit like using a hoe in your garden. You know, I don't believe in rotivators, but turning your soil over is really key to. I mean, Robin can tell you lots. His garden's fantastic, but it doesn't come from just leaving it to do what it needs to do.
Yeah, so in a sense, the fishery itself is also key to the ecosystem here.
Absolutely. There's a film online, and you know, they say if you don't manage the fishery sustainably, you know, you create a tenement, is the word they used. You know, you create something that isn't active and isn't worthwhile without harvesting something from the wild populations. They probably won't do very well either. but harvesting something that's too small to have left anything behind, it just winds me up.
Yeah. Steve has another question about the algae you use to feed the oyster larvae. Is that cultured in any special way? Do you just harvest it from the fowl, or is it somehow tailored to improve the yield you get of oysters?
Okay, good question. To be honest, our aim is to get the larvae or the spat, once they've settled, up the river as quickly as possible so that they can feed on the natural algae, plankton, food that's in the watercourse. You know, we're very lucky. The hydrodynamics and the food and all the right things add up for it to be a native oyster fishery already. Looking at creating an algae farm was phenomenal costs, way beyond any of our budgets. And seeing as we had a river right there, and we're going to use that river very soon, in a month or two, we looked at a much quicker solution, and we buy in a product called a shellfish diet 1800, and it's produced in America and distributed by a company in the UK called Vericon Aqua, I think. Basically, it's a quart, so a bit like a pint milk bottle. It comes with some very concentrated algae, consisting of 5 or 6 algae. In fact, I've set up a Fal Fishery Co-op CIC YouTube channel recently. There are links on the Saving ESTER page, or I think there were links on the Saving ESTER page. You can search it. In those small films, I did a series of short films on the very first day we set up the hatchery. So after building it all and getting the oysters in the tanks, in those films, there's a couple of short films about the algae concentrate we use. Amazing product, really helped. I wonder if we were overfeeding our larvae because we couldn't ascertain a head count. We didn't have the equipment that we ordered on time, i.e. a counting cell. And that has arrived, but a bit too late. But it's very important to have a head count, estimate the total number of larvae, work out how much feed you need to give them, when and where, and then program your easy dose feeder peristaltic pump to issue that feed supply. Some of that was also part of our problem. You know, during July and August, we couldn't really make a head count. We couldn't estimate how many larvae per 1,000 litres, and therefore we couldn't really work out the amount of algae we needed to give them. So I just maintained what I thought was the right manually, and that may have been too much feed, which apparently is a really bad thing. They just spend all their time feeding and not growing, and then they give up.
Oh,
Hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you. Where were we? Yeah, we've got another question from Loveday as well, which I'm guessing plays into, we talked a little bit about it earlier on as well. She's asking, is there any work needing to be done on improving the settling areas or the reefs?
There's lots of talk amongst the committee for improving the fishery in many ways. Unfortunately, the management authority, IFCA, Cornwall Inshore Fisheries Conservation Authority, don't seem to have the power to introduce something. I've taken it all the way to committee level, and without scientific evidence, they're not prepared to make any amendments to the fishery regulatory or management plan. Part of our CIC and our research is to come up with that scientific evidence to present to them from scientific basis. I've been there and they said, you're not a scientist, Chris, we can't listen to you, you know, but it's now to present that information in a scientific way that helps them make some management decisions that will either relay some culture. Now, we can't just buy oysters from somewhere else and put it on the fishery because they might spread disease and other things. There's talk of a buyback scheme where IFCA want to buy some small oysters off the fishermen and put them on Parsons Bank and see if they're still there in 3 years' time. They're not going to be. It's simple as that. They'll either sink in the mud or someone will have them away. Part of our aquaculture project, again, what we're trying to do is lots of things. I've got a lot of ideas, and it's to try and find people that will take one of those ideas and run with it, and find several people to do that. Is to store the oyster shell that I've opened over the past 5-10 years oyster shell, native and Pacific, mussel shell, queen scallop, king scallop. In the empty trays until we have a need for them, up at the river to see whether they act as a spat collector so that we can find trigger points during the year. Some say it's peak summer, some say it's spring and autumn. It's definitely to do with water temperature, and it's very likely to do with the plankton and the food resources. It's really, they get really fed, then the food stops, then they start reproducing. And it's one of those kind of, that's just one of the theories and projects we need to, so there's 100 or 1,000 questions, and each one of those is a sort of science project. And, you know, we want to be able to provide those answers to the management authority who can then make a decision to protect the fishery. It's seems a hell of a long way round, but you know, again, I hope that kind of answers the question. Lovely.
Absolutely, cheers. There's been a few comments in the chat as well on the back and forth, and a bit of a back and forth as well, how, well, Robin pointed out how this interaction of science, engineering and politics in all of this is absolutely fascinating. I fully agree. It just goes to show how you can never really view an issue as isolated. There's always so much more going on as well.
Absolutely. And I think one thing I'm trying to get across is, you know, I'm not slating how other people have done it for decades, but it's not working. We have so much more potential in a very sustainable way to all of us to earn more money, all of us to look after the habitat and to leave something behind. Fishermen are petrified of scientists because they're going to close the fishery. Scientists are not really working with the fishermen because they would like the fishery to stop and no dredging to happen. And it's that I get, and the racing fleet, they don't want anything to do with either of them.
Yeah.
But it's that kind of stuck in the middle that I go to one person, they go, "Good on you, keep going," and the other person goes, "You don't know what you're talking about." But I found the science side of it fascinating. I found the fact that 160 people are involved in restoration projects around the UK and Europe. 160 people are getting paid a job to look at habitats mostly, which include native oysters as a keystone species. We've just got to protect our fishery rather than me get beaten up for getting the fishery closed. It's important to have a fishery. It's important to have an industry. It's a very old industry. And like you say, science, politics, policies, and fishermen, man. A good thing is someone years ago, decades ago, described a collective noun for a Fal oysterman as a backstab, which I thought was, you know, pretty harsh. And it turns out that that's, you talk to all of them and they all agree. You get them in a room and none of them agree. And it's, you know, it's been like that for me for over a decade, and I'm kind of working my way past it. But the politics, the policies, the licensing process to get that aquaculture site, it's not just get a loan and get a bit of river. There was a habitat regulation assessment, a biosecurity measure plan before I was even licensed as an aquaculture production business. And it's the second business I have because the other limited company is also all of those things. But yeah,
I guess you do very quickly learn to look out for a backstab of fishermen then.
Yeah. Robin, we'll have more chats over the fence, but you know, this is what I'm trying to get across from this presentation and the one I did on Monday and the radio and things. Is we need some help, you know, policy level, local level, community level. It can help a lot of people, but only a few people are benefiting right now.
Great, thanks. We are slowly getting towards 7 odd, and this would have made a great closing speech, but there is another couple of questions or so. So if you do still have the power, I will ask another question from Steve, who asks about the water quality again and its effect on the fisheries. Steve wonders, is there any research that identifies what could be done to best improve water quality for oysters? And specifically, do you know if agricultural runoff is a big issue here?
The best thing I can point you to, Steve, is the sanitary survey. Now, every 5 or 10 years, there's an obligation for them to carry out a sanitary survey. I mean, I've seen the catchment area of the Fal. It is massive. You think of all the little tributaries that come into all the little rivers and stuff. Farmers' sewage or runoff is a big problem. I think the Environment Agency have been pretty good over the years of trying to stop that as much as possible, enforcing slurry pits. I don't know, how it's done, but there is a problem. Southwest Water contribute quite a lot to the problems. We're a flood tide estuary. We do get some big hits. I've been to Food Standards Agency, an Environment Agency, and their method of classification for shellfish harvesting waters is archaic. I'll tell you, that's about the only way to describe it. RiverX, a guy called Miles, spent quite a lot of money and quite a lot of time pre-process testing and end product testing, and he explained to the Food Standards that when they close his river again, he's going to carry on trading, and they said they'll take him to court, and he said, I can't wait, because he had all the data to prove that his process is bulletproof, but their archaic shellfish water quality classification, it doesn't work. So they're classifying something. So they do a test once or twice a month. They did one today. The samples go off to Porton. A week later, we get a result. If it's really high, they tell us we can't harvest. To be honest, the stuff I harvested a week ago when the sampling was done has already been eaten. So it's a problem, but I wouldn't say it's going to close us. It closes us for a period of time. You probably remember in the news a couple of years ago, the mussel fishery was closed for 22 weeks. 19 of those weeks, the water quality was perfect, but it was closed because it didn't meet a 90% clean data set. Had to be 90% compliant. You get 2 bad spikes out of 10 and you're closed. They basically brought that EU rule in and then realised quite a bit of the area was going to be closed because it wasn't 90% compliant. But if you take a sample once a month, you might be hitting the worst day of the month and you're going to get a bad reading. But for the other 29, 30 days of the month, it's perfectly clean. But so there's not enough, but Port Health do their best. They're totally underfunded to go around and take all these samples. There's 30 odd sample points on the Fal. That's a lot of little dots all over. But EU rules say if you're not 90% compliant with a clean water course, then you're closed. Dude, you've got to find some of the sources.
Yeah, absolutely. From my own work, I know that antibiotic-resistant bacteria are an issue with agricultural runoff as well. I wonder if that's something that spills over into oysters too. That would be really interesting to look at.
Yeah.
There's a couple of more last-minute questions coming in. I don't know if I dare get into the last one. It sounds like it could be another another big one. We'll go for Robin's one first, which is probably a bit quicker. So Robin asks if algae can sense the presence of oysters. Does that mean they might be attracted to old and empty oyster shells as well, or is it only alive oyster flesh essentially?
Is algae attracted to oysters or vice versa?
Did you mention that earlier?
Baby oysters are definitely attracted to reefs of live oysters. Maybe the hydrodynamics of a river will improve algae or plankton in a small dense area. If there's a little eddy, for example, then maybe that area is constantly being fed, whereas some of the outer areas maybe don't have that stability of the water around them. The fishery is a natural fishery. The reason it's a natural fishery is because it's the perfect environment for it. If there were any ifs or buts, it wouldn't happen. So it's you've got like 100 check boxes and they all have to work before that larvae will grow for 2 to 4, 5, 6 years. Any one of those tick boxes that aren't ticked, and it just doesn't happen.
Great. Sorry, we've just got clarifications. Robin did mean the spat rather than the algae.
Yeah. Baby oysters are definitely attracted to live oysters. They might also be attracted to the shell, but it's probably more enzymes and hormones that are given off by live oysters that the spat and the larvae can sense. But it's definitely also the substrate, so the oyster shell. When larvae do stick to mussel shells probably just as well, but that's maybe only used because there isn't any native oyster shell to use as the colt. I'm pretty lucky. I've saved years and years of stuff, but
yeah. Great. Well, thank you very much then. I will, I'm afraid, gloss over Loveday's last question. If you are willing and Chris is willing, feel free to stay on afterwards for a little while and discuss that in person. Otherwise, yeah, we have had people leaving over the past few minutes as well. So I think we should probably wrap this up and come to an end. So thank you very much, Chris.
Do you have a list of the questions that were asked? Can you save that list, that chat? Or
Yeah, I can do.
I mean, if you save that chat, and if anyone is still there and, you know, you want to contact me, as I say, it's saving ESTER, ESTER.co.uk, and you can email Ranger at Saving Esther. And
we're happy to share some of your links as well. As you were saying, you're looking for volunteers in various different areas. If you've got something you want us to share on our social media, please let us know.
Yeah,
we'll have
fantastic. It's raising awareness about this very unique fishery and seeing if we can get some volunteers and some donations or some grant funding to help us do it, you know.
So yeah, thank you very much, Chris. At this point, with everyone who is still left, I will unmute everyone in a second so we can give you another round of virtual applause. Just to thank you for this amazingly fascinating talk and great Q&A.
Thanks very much. I'll go to another little
Thank you.